Last session we discussed about, we in fact ended the session discussing bond parameters. See, when you have single bond, double bond and triple bond, we learned that triple bond will have more bond energy and bond length would be smaller. Similarly, when you compare carbon-hydrogen bond, which is associated with a single bond, double bond or a triple bond, then also the triple bonded carbon bonding with hydrogen will have a smaller bond length. And since it has smaller bond length, it would have larger bond energy. We discussed the fact that if you have bulky groups, which means like methyl groups, if they are increasing, it would start having repulsions between them. So these two bulky groups, for instance, this methyl group and this methyl group, will exhibit large repulsions between them, because of which the bond angle increases. So by the time if we have very bulky methyl groups here, so the bond angle will increase. Next fundamental we learned was Bend's rule, where if you have a strong electronegative element pulling the electrons, the entire p character drains into it and the other bonds will start developing s character. So if S character increases, bond length decreases and bond energy increases. So you can see here bond energy has increased because the S character has increased. This is the other fundamental we learned. Next, comparing dipole moments. Generally, dipole moments will always depend on two factors. One is the charge, the other one is the distance. That is separation, charge separation. So certain cases, most of the cases, it is the charge that is dominant. So more the charge, more will be the dipole moment, which is more the charge separation. Okay. So certain cases like CH3Cl, CH3F, we have some exception. Otherwise, if you see the bond, if you see the dipole moment, always the charge is dominant factor. We came across the fact that if you have vector sums of dipoles, we will have either polar or non-polar solvents established. The resultant dipole moment, if it is non-zero, it is polar substance. If it is equal to zero, it is a non-polar substance. For example, carbon dioxide is a non-polar substance because its resultant dipole moment is zero. Similarly, we saw certain cases drawing the dipole directions and trying to find out where the high dipole moment would be present. So we took few cases. One very important case what we learned was hydroquinone, quinol or thioquinols, where the lone pairs distribution makes it to have certain dipole moment. Okay, and hence they show polar nature. Right? Till this point we studied. Now let us continue further with formula analysis. See, formula analysis is the case where we try to find out what are the maximum number of hydrogens there must be present. Correct? Based on that, we will start commenting on what would happen to the molecule if at all it has any double bond equivalent, if at all there is any cyclic structure or not. This is something which we can analyze. See, suppose an organic compound has n number of carbon atoms. Okay, maximum number of hydrogens that it can possess is 2n plus 2, by which you can get alkanes, right? So suppose if you have Cn, then y max can be 2n plus 2. This is maximum number of hydrogen atoms we can have. So I'm pretty sure you know this. When you compare an alkane, for instance, if you take CH4, correct? So there is one carbon. So for that, the maximum number of hydrogens that it can possess is 2 into 1 plus 2, so which is 4. So all alkanes would have maximum number of hydrogens, correct? Now suppose in the molecule if there was any presence of oxygen or sulfur, okay, in case if there is any oxygen or sulfur, then it does not change the relation of carbon and hydrogen. It would still contain to be the same, which means Y max now will still be equal to 2n plus 2. I'll show you an example. For example, if we have C2H5OH, which we call it as ethanol. If you write in a condensed form, it is C2H6O. Now, even if you do not have oxygen, still the maximum number of hydrogens are 2n plus 2 only. Alright. So that is what it meant, that the maximum number of hydrogens even in the presence of oxygen or sulfur will always be same. Correct. So I hope you got the point there. Next, in case if there is a presence of halogens, okay, halogens as in fluorine, chlorine, bromine or iodine, any of these elements present. In this, if the molecular formula has any of these halogens, it is same as that of presence of hydrogen. Okay. So in that case, what we do, first we write it as Y max, which is the maximum number of hydrogens, as 2n plus 2, correct, because that is what we expect. But since the number of halogens will make a difference here, so we will write this as minus Z. That would be the maximum number of hydrogens which we can have. So more or less like halogen is taking away the place of hydrogen. For instance, if we have C2H5Cl, okay, ethyl chloride, here you can see the number of hydrogens, maximum number of hydrogens we can have is 5, which means it is actually 2n plus 2 minus 1, there is 1 chlorine present here, so which makes it 5. So the same formula. Next, in case if the molecular formula has nitrogen in it, got it? In case if the molecular formula has nitrogen, there will always be one extra hydrogen added to the system, which means Y max will be equal to now 2n plus 2, got it? Plus the number of nitrogens it has. So that would be the maximum number of nitrogens. Best example, C2H5NH2, ethanamine. Now you see the maximum number of, if at all I write the condensed form, C2H7N1. This is how it is, correct? So which means you can check it out, for every one nitrogen we have one extra hydrogen being added. The maximum number of hydrogen is supposed to be 2n plus 2, and because you have a nitrogen, extra nitrogen 1, you have to add here. Got it? Now this is a basic fundamental which you can understand, that if there is a presence of any alkane, alkene or alkyne, this is the first thing you will check out, that is what are the maximum number of hydrogens possible in that molecule. Let's see how does this help. For example, if you have to judge whether these molecules which I have written exist or not, this is the first thing, like whether these molecules will exist or not. So what is the first thing we will do? I will find out Y max in this case, which means maximum number of hydrogens which it should have. Theoretically what it is, there are 4 we know that formula is 2n plus 2 plus Z, because there is a nitrogen present, which means 2 times of 4 carbons are there plus 2 plus there are 2 nitrogens present. So you can see it is coming out to be 12. So which means this molecule will exist. Yes, this molecule can exist. Let us see here now. Okay, suppose if we have C4H12N3, got it? Now here if we check out what is the maximum number of hydrogens which we have, correct? So we have 2 times of 4 plus 2 plus 3, right? So we have how much? 13. Okay, anything less than that, anything less than Y max, we can expect that it could exist, got it? If you have anything less than that, we can expect that it could exist. Suppose if you check out the next one, C4H13N3, okay, here also if you check out how much we get, 8 plus 2 plus 3, got it? So we have 13. So yes, this would exist. Okay, now check out here C4H6N2. Suppose here also we can see 8 plus 2 plus 2. Okay, so this is 12, where 6 is quite less than 12, so definitely this can exist. Anything which is exceeding that value will not exist. Okay, For instance, if I take, okay, C4 H14 N3. Now if you check out, it is 8 plus 3 plus 2, sorry, 8 plus 2 plus 3. So it is 30. Why max? The maximum number of hydrogens that you can exhibit, which you can have, is only 13. And if it is given 14, which means definitely this molecule does not. Let us see about this one, this last one, C6H5NO2. Suppose if at all I have C6H5NO2. Remember, oxygen, sulfur does not have any significance on this number. So Y max will be equal to 6 times of 2 plus 2 plus 1. I guess you understood that why I have added 1, because there is one nitrogen. 2n plus 2, again let me repeat the formula, 2n plus 2 plus z. Z is the number of nitrogens, and 2n here is representing the number of carbons. So there are 6 carbons, 6 into 2, 12, plus 2, 14, plus 1, 15. So maximum it can exist is 15, and here I have given only 5, so definitely this will exist. I hope all of you understood that. So whether a molecule exists or not can be perceived from this. Anybody has a doubt here? Please do ask. In anywhere, in any compound, if you put oxygen, check out. Suppose if you have let us write a simple ethane. This is ethane, C2H6. Now, if you have oxygen as a single bond, how would that be? We have, let's say, these two hydrogens, hydrogen. Oxygen being a bivalent, I can insert oxygen any position here. Now check, earlier also there were 6 hydrogens, now also there are 6 hydrogens. So is the oxygen making any difference?
No,
No,
sir.
right? So for the maximum value of hydrogen, oxygen and sulfur does not make any difference. Got that?
Only those two elements, sir.
Oxygen and sulfur only. Bivalent, all bivalent. The bivalent inorganic compounds, the bivalent which we use are only oxygen and sulfur.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sir,
Yes, beta.
if we take cyclopropane, sir,
Cyclopropane, okay.
in that if all the bonds in between carbons are double bonds, then there will
It
be no
cannot exist.
hydrogens. No?
This cannot exist. It may exist. It may exist. It doesn't give a compulsion. Got it? It may exist. But if it is greater than that, it is definitely not going to exist. Is that clear? Continuing this, we got to first understand what is a degree of unsaturation, or this term is used in various different terminologies, used as index of hydrogen deficiency, or it is also used as double bond equivalent. Got it? Through our course, we'll be using these terms a lot. DU, degree of unsaturation, or we'll be using it as DOU, degree of unsaturation, or we'll be using it as DE, degree double bond equivalent. These three are more frequently used during our course. Now, for instance, if you have CnHX, okay, now what will be the DU for the same, degree of unsaturation for the same? See, the maximum number of hydrogens that you expect are to be 2n plus 2. This is what you expect. This is maximum that it can have. That minus x divided by 2 will give us how much is the degree of unsaturation. Okay. Or the other way of writing is, the general formula of writing degree of unsaturation is C plus 1, okay, which means the number of carbons plus 1 minus hydrogen plus hydrogen plus halogens minus nitrogens by 2. Alright. This is another way of putting as the formula. I will show you with an example. For instance, if you have C3H6, okay, I want to calculate what is degree of unsaturation. So what is it? I will take 2 times of 3, 2 times of 3 plus 2. This is maximum number of hydrogens I am expecting, minus the actual given hydrogens are 6 divided by 2, which means how much I am getting. You can see this is 6 plus 2, 8, 8 minus 6 by 2, which is 1. So degree of unsaturation is 1. I can use this formula also. Let me show you with that formula as well. Suppose if you have this, there are 3 carbons, 3 plus 1. So that makes it 4 minus number of hydrogens that are given to us is how much? 6. 4 minus 6 plus there are no halogens, there are no nitrogens by 2. So that is also coming as 1. So you could use this formula or this formula, any comfortable way you are, okay. Now check this out, what I am trying to say. If you have degree of unsaturation 1, what does that represent? See, degree of unsaturation 1 means either it can exist in a ring structure, it can exist in a ring structure, it can have one double bond. Either it can have a ring structure or it can have a double bond. Every time you count the degree of unsaturation, it will tell us whether it can exist in a ring form or it can have a double bond. So best part here is, suppose the question that would be asked to you is what are the different isomers of C3H6. If you come across C3H6, you will be asked what are the total number of isomers it can have. Isomers as in molecules having same molecular formula but different structures. So for instance, if you see C3H6, based on the degree of unsaturation, which means there should be one double bond equivalent or one ring structure. So can you guess, I can have two different structures. One is this kind, the other one is this kind. These are the two possible structures for C3H6. I hope all of you understood that, right? So this is the way it will be asked, like what are the different types of structures or total number of structural forms which you can get from a molecular formula. Let me show you one more. Suppose if you have C4H8, if you have C4H8, check out degree of unsaturation. Degree of unsaturation will be 4 plus 1 minus 8 by 2. I am using the second formula, everybody. Check out this formula, I am using this one. That is C plus 1 H plus X minus N by 2. So now I would have how much? This has 5 minus 4, which means 1. So degree of unsaturation is 1. If it is 1, which means I can have one double bond or one ring structure. Okay. So what are the possibilities? Check out. One possibility is a double bond is placed here. Other possibility is double bond is placed here. Other possibility is with a branch a double bond is placed. One possibility is only ring form. One possibility is a ring which is 3-membered. So either I can have a 4-membered ring, 3-membered ring, a one double bond equivalent here. So you can see there are 5 possible products I can get from C4H8. That is where degree of unsaturation helps us understand that how many possible products we can have. Okay. Let me show you with one more example. If you have C3H6O, check out degree of unsaturation. This is 3 plus 1 minus 6 by 2. In the formula, there is no significance of oxygen. Check out H plus X minus N by 2, what you will have. So therefore, we will have 4 minus 3, which means 1. So there is 1 degree of unsaturation. Now 1 degree of unsaturation is equivalent to 1 double bond equivalent, 1 double bond, or it can be 1 ring form. Okay. See the possibilities here. I can have this way. This is one possibility, OH. I can have a double bond like this. I can have and double bond here with OH. Got it? Next, I can have 1, 2, 3. Right, I have 3 carbons, so double bond O and H here. I can have double bond O here. I can make cyclic structure like this, 4-membered. I can make 3-membered cyclic structure as OH like this. I can make another cyclic structure like this. Yeah, 1, 2. Another cyclic structure with oxygen and methyl group here. You can see so many possible products you can get. You might be wondering, sir, how you know all these products? Slowly, when you learn the functional groups, you'll get to know. Okay, like what are all the functional groups? This is alcohols. These are aldehydes. These are ketones. These are oxiranes. These are epoxides. Correct? So, like this, you'll slowly get to learn what are all the functional groups. For now, our most important idea is to calculate the degree of unsaturation. Okay, and as you go towards isomerism, you should be prepared enough to understand how many molecules you can get, possible molecules you can get. Okay, I hope all of you understood that. Taking that into consideration, now we can calculate what is the degree of unsaturation just by checking the molecule. Let me show you one of them. For example, let us take this one. Okay, here if you observe closely, there is one ring and one double bond. Correct? So without any calculation, I can simply say that the degree of unsaturation would be 2, because there is one ring form and one double bond form. Same way, suppose if you check out here, this is a combination of 2 rings, one ring above, one ring below. So 2 rings is equivalent to 2 equivalents. Same way, let's say for example prismane. In prismane, check out the number of rings I have. This is one ring, ring number 1, ring number 2, ring number 3, ring number 4. Sorry. So it is a combination of 4 rings. This is, see, without using a formula I am doing it. Alright. So once you get aware of understanding the structure, it becomes easier for us to learn what would be the degree of unsaturation. So please make a note,
Sir?
everyone. Yeah.
Sir,
Yes.
Prismane is a combination of 3 rings now, sir.
What beta? 4 rings.
Down
Observe
also
carefully.
ring is there, no sir.
Dekho, 4 rings. Check out carefully. 1 ring, 2 ring, 3 rings, 4 rings. Okay. This ring which you are thinking as a 5th ring, that already has been occupied. Got it? Because that was already considered in all the 4 forms. Okay. The other way of putting at it, see, just write all the molecular formula here. Check out how many carbons we have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 carbons we have. C6. Check out the number of hydrogens we have. Every carbon has 3 bonds. So only one hydrogen will be left. So one here, one here, one here, one here, one here, and one here. So how much is that beta? C6H6. So this is the molecular formula for prismane. Now calculate the degree of unsaturation. How much we have? 2 times of 6, correct? Or just now we have checked the formula. 6 plus 1 minus 6 by 2. How much I am getting? 7 minus 3. What is the degree of unsaturation? 4. Why are we dividing? Very good question, beta. That's a very important question, everyone. So he has a very valid point. Everyone check it out. C2H4. Okay. Whoever has asked, just please check this carefully, beta. If I calculate degree of unsaturation, I am getting it as 2 plus 1 minus 4 by 2, which is 1. And degree of unsaturation is 1. What does this mean? I told you this is equivalent to one double bond, correct? See, if you have to make this C2H4 into an alkane, suppose if I give you C2H4, then degree of unsaturation will be 2 plus 1 minus 4 by 2, which is coming as 1. So, in case if I want this molecule to make it into an alkane, C2H4 is nothing but we have C double bond C, H, H, H and H, and I want to make it into an alkane. So then what should I do? I will add one hydrogen, correct? So basically I have to add two hydrogen atoms to this so that it can become an alkane. Are you getting it? So one double bond is equivalent to two hydrogens, isn't or no? That is why we are dividing it by 2. I hope you understood that. Same thing. Suppose if you have C2H4, if at all I have to add nitrogen, I cannot add nitrogen just like that. No, nitrogen will come as NH2 minus. Got it? So it is
Yes,
already
sir.
coming with
Yes,
two
sir.
hydrogens, na beta. See here problem is if you have CH3, oh CH double bond CH2. You're saying this one, right? Yeah, this is possible.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, if DU is 2, then 2 double bonds, 2 rings are possible.
But I'll take one case. For example, if you have C4H6, okay, here Du is 2 now, so I can have one double bond, okay, write this way, one double bond plus one ring, or I can have two rings, I can have one triple bond. Okay, these are all the possible ways.
Sir, can't we have two double bonds like two rings?
Yeah, two double bonds also. Two double bonds. Okay, to give you examples, this is about, I'm not writing all the structures, two double bonds, one triple bond, two rings, okay, one ring and one double bond, 3, 4, like this. Okay, so these are all the possible cases. One ring will always come as common overall. Okay, if you take two rings, if you take four rings, half and half will become common. But anyways, my best suggestion would be to always find Du. Write the molecular formula, calculate Du. Just to be double sure, okay?
Sir, got sir.
Sir,
हाँ बेटा.
sir, alkanes have degree of unsaturation 0 always, huh, sir?
Yes. Any alkanes
Sir,
will
then,
have degree of unsaturation 0.
sir, then can't we consider cubane as one type of alkane, sir?
Cubane? No.
As
Cyclic alkanes. See, aliphatic alkanes will have 0. Not cyclic alkanes, okay? Aliphatic as in open chain.
That means only single chain alkanes you are considering, sir.
Open chain alkanes.
Okay, sir.
Sir, that's why the alkanes are saturated compounds.
What beta? That's why?
Alkanes are saturated compounds.
Correct. Alkanes are called saturated because of the same reason. All alkenes, alkynes, they are called olefins. Correct? They are unsaturated.
Yes, sir. Paraffins, olefins.
Yes.
Sir,
Shall we go
last
ahead?
two answers, sir.
So you don't want to do it on your own? 7 and 10. Okay. Try that. Check out and confirm once again. Yeah. 5. Now,
Yes,
let us come to the next part of it. See, this is a very theoretical part. I want all of you to just close your books and listen for a while, okay? Because the entire theory I've already written, so you don't, it's just a time waste to write all of that. We will understand the fundamental carefully. Is this clear? So I request all of you to just focus on, the theory part here carefully. Now, the entire idea is to purify the organic compounds. There are many processes, out of which the most important processes which we will be studying are crystallization, distillation, okay, and chromatography. So these are the three major ways by which we can separate the purify the organic compounds. Now, when it comes to crystallization, well, the process of forming the pure crystals, when you cool the impure sample, right, in a suitable solvent is called crystallization. It means if I take any solvent, and I add, you know, organic substance which has some impurity, on adding that, my expectation is, the principle behind crystallization is, this organic part will dissolve more compared to that of this impurity. Okay, pretty simple. Suppose if you have petrol, okay, but that petrol have lot of, let's say, charcoal in it, or rather we can say calcium carbonate, because during extraction of crude oil, imagine, along with petrol, correct, I had lot of calcium carbonate that has come through, correct, and petrol, after removing after purification, we will get lot of wax also, correct, Vaseline what we call, correct. So now I want to purify this Vaseline as much as possible and remove out that calcium carbonate and any other dirt that has been coming through. Just keep listening to me carefully, okay. Now what will I take? I will take that wax, or so called the Vaseline, which has an impurity, and add it to some solvent. Which solvent is more preferable here? Any organic solvent, okay, like oils maybe. Any fatty oils I'll take and add them. In fatty oils, this impurity does not get dissolved, got it? Only this organic compound will get dissolved. I hope all of you with me on this. So if that happens, now I'll get a completely dissolved form of organic substance, and the impurity will be left over as a residue. So if you get that, what will I do? Right? I can simply filter that and remove that impurity. And whatever the organic compound which I got now, I'll start cooling it. This entire solution I will cool. Once you cool that, the crystals will come out of it, correct? So solid crystals will come. That means that hard part of wax will come out of it, and that would be extracted as crystals, and that will be more pure form. I hope all of you understood the principle, basic principle behind crystallization. Let me repeat once again. The basic principle is the solubility of the solid which is present in the organic compound should be easily dissolved as you increase the temperature, and when you decrease the temperature, it should easily crystallize. Correct? I have written that here. So when you refer back the notes, check out this statement. The solubility of solid must increase as the temperature increases, and as the saturated solution is prepared at higher temperature, which when you cool, it should crystallize out. We do the same thing even with the sugar, got it? While extracting sugar also, got it, from jaggery, what we do? First, we heat that in the solvent. Solvent is water most of the time. Then we take it to a saturated level. From the saturated level, then will slowly crystallize. That is by cooling. When you cool that, slowly the sugar crystals will come out. So this is the basic technique of crystallization. Now crystallization can be done in two ways. One is simple crystallization, which is what I have written here. Simple crystallization. In simple crystallization, there is nothing complex here. So we have a heated funnel. Observe it carefully. This is a heated funnel in which I will add the solvent and the substance. Got it? So that organic substance, and there is already a solvent present in it. And I'll start heating both of them. And this funnel will have a filter paper down with it. So slowly the organic plus solvent which got dissolved together will start dripping out, and you'll get this filtrate. Got it? This is a hot filtrate. We will put that hot filtrate in a Buchner solution here, Buchner funnel here. This is called the Buchner funnel, the shape. In this Buchner funnel, Again, I will have one filter paper on which I am adding this filtrate and start cooling it. Okay. On cooling it, I will start getting crystals. I hope all of you understood. Now, after cooling, beta, there would be still some liquid which is dripping down, right? And this is the solvent which may still have some amount of the organic compound, and with some impurities might also be there. So, this solution which we got is called mother liquor. The mother liquor is a combination of the solvent and some small part of organic which is left over plus some more impurities which are present. Got it? We use this mother liquor back into this filter and recycle it. Got it? This is how we'll start getting the crystals. Got it? Now, the crystals which we got may still be wet, no? Because it would still have that solvent on it. So, we take all these crystals and add it to the desiccator. Desiccator is an instrument, which will pump air into it. At the same time, it will have anhydrous calcium chloride. Anhydrous calcium chloride will absorb all the moisture which is present in it. So, if these crystals have any moisture, that anhydrous chloride will absorb. Okay. And this is a vacuum desiccator, which means in case if there is any volatile gases coming out, all of them will come out and they can be removed out of this. Okay. Because within the crystals, if there is any gases stuck, slowly those will also come out of it and they will get out of the vent. And finally, what we have is a pure crystal. See, from crystals, whatever that has been formed, this crystals, because it is open to atmosphere and because it has some solvent present on it and it is in touch with that solvent, this crystal would be wet, na beta? This might be wet. So, this wet crystal I am taking into a desiccator. See, desiccator is an instrument where we will remove the unwanted gases and moisture. Okay. To remove moisture, I need a drying agent. What is a best drying agent I can use? Anhydrous calcium chloride. Anhydrous calcium chloride will absorb moisture this way, dot to H2O. Okay. So, in case if there is any moisture, it will completely absorb the moisture, and also if there are some gases which are present, see, you are heating here, correct? So, there might be some gases of sulfur dioxide, got it? Some oxygen, some carbon dioxide that may be present, that might be stuck in the crystals, got it? And those will slowly come out of it. Okay. So, eventually what do we have is a pure crystal form which is completely dry. Now, that is about, I told you one important terminology here is what is mother liquor. Okay. Yes, beta. Okay. Now, when it comes to fractional crystallization, the second type is a fractional crystallization. Right. Here we have two or more valuable solids. Got it? Not just one solid. Maybe just like wax I told you, it may be combined with maybe some kind of other gels, maybe like lipstick for instance. Got it? That wax is slightly different than the regular wax. Got it? So, if that also has to be separated because both of them are very valuable, so in that case we will be using fractional crystallization. Okay. Here the fundamental is both those solids must have different solubilities in solvent. Like the oil which you choose should be such that it should have different solubilities of those two solids. Got it? That will help in getting separating out. How we can do that? Same thing, till this point it is fine. First, solubility of one of the solvent would be more. So, in the filtrate, one would be more than the other. For instance, I have a candle wax, imagine this way, candle wax plus lipstick wax. Okay. Now, these two, imagine if the wax, this wax dissolves more, correct? So, here what will be left over? Lipstick wax will be more left over, wax will get more dissolved, and then you crystallize that. Got it? Then you use some other solvent where wax get less dissolved, lipstick get more dissolved in it. Filtrate that, again you crystallize that back. Got it? That way you will do fractional distillation, fractional crystallization. Okay. So fractional crystallization is a method used when you have more one or two or more valuable solids to be separated out. Is that clear, everyone? Next is a sublimation. Sublimation is very straightforward. When there are certain molecules, there are certain solids which directly convert into vapor state, rather their liquid state existence is very less. For instance, carbon dioxide, iodine. Okay, same way, so if those solids which directly change from solid to vapor state, that can be used to separate through sublimation. Best examples are these: camphor, naphthalene, anthracene, benzoic acid. Okay, benzoic acid that does have a liquid state also, but if you use sufficient temperature during sublimation, it will escape out that liquid state and can be converted directly to vapor state. Got it? I hope you understood. Acha, how do we do that? Got it? So we sublimate the entire organic compound, and whatever the impurities which are present, we expect them to be non-volatile, which means they do not come out as vapors. Okay, and that's how we purify camphor also, by the way. Okay, so whatever the camphor crystals which we get, first we heat them, okay, in the absence of oxygen, and collect all those vapors and crystallize it. Okay, condense it, and whatever the impurities,
Sir,
like,
means the residue is impurity, sir.
yes, the residue which is a solid form left over is an impurity which is non-volatile. I hope the fundamental is clear for sublimation. So sublimation, there
Yes,
is
sir.
not much to discuss there. So it is just the case. One thing you got to understand, that the impurity must be non-volatile. Okay. Next is distillation. Okay. Right. Distillation becomes a very important process for lot of separations of liquids. Got it?
Sir,
Yes. Distillation is a process where we must have some, impure liquid. Got it? But at its boiling point, we should be able to vaporize that and then condense the vapors, and that's how we will get the pure liquid by cooling. This is a process which you may have heard before also. So what we do, we take the liquid and we start boiling it, and we boil till it reaches its vapor pressure becomes equal to external pressure. And you know the term boiling point, right? So boiling point, in fact, is that particular temperature where the vapor pressure of the liquid will be equal to the external pressure. Got it? So at the boiling point, most of its liquid will convert into vapors, and we take that vapors and separate and condense them, and that's how we will separate out two liquids. This process is distillation. In simple distillation, what we are doing, suppose if at all I have two liquids out of which one of them is impure. Okay, we expect that the required or the desired liquid and impure liquid, between these two, the boiling point of impure liquid is more. This is what we expect. If the desired liquid has less boiling point, it will evaporate faster compared to that of impure liquid. So you will heat to that level where its boiling point has reached, desired liquid's boiling point has reached. Once that has reached, we will take those vapors, and using this Liebig condenser, basically there is a water inlet and outlet which will condense this vapors, and finally we will get a distillate, and that distillate will have pure liquid of the desired form. I think this is a pretty straightforward one, so you should be able to figure it out. Okay. Now, in case of fractional distillation, what is important point here is the difference in the boiling point must be at least 30 degrees. 30 degrees or more will give you appreciable amount. Okay. Because if it is very less, then this liquid also will start vaporizing almost at the same time, and most of this content will come, so you won't be able to separate them out properly. This is simple distillation. Fractional distillation is when you have more than two valuable liquids to be separated, like petrol, diesel, if you have to separate them. Got it? Then you will check out what is their boiling point. Approximately the boiling point difference should be 1 to 15 degrees. Got it? So if you don't have at least 1 to 15 degrees, it would become very difficult to separate them out. Got it? Now let me show you how does the fractional distillation looks like and what exactly happens here. First, the mixture of liquids which we are taking is heated at high temperatures. Got it? And this is slowly being passed through the column, fractionating column. Fractionating column will have different outlets actually. This is one of the outlet I have shown, but there would be one outlet here, there may be one outlet here, there may be one outlet here, like this. Okay. So as the condensed, as the vapors which are coming first, you can check it out, there would be some vapors which will be coming first. The vapors which come fast, or the first ones which are coming here, are the ones which have lower boiling point. Okay, got it? And they will reach through that and start condensing here, and we'll get this as the distillate, and this distillate will be the one which has lower boiling point. The process is quite similar, except that we can start condensing here of one particular liquid, then change the, first of all you start with a particular boiling point. Okay, so let's say if you have to, I'll take with an example. Let's say I have to separate methyl alcohol, that is CH3OH, got it, and acetone, CH3COCH3. These two I have taken. The boiling point of methyl is 65 degrees. This is around, methanol is 65 degrees, and this is around 56 degrees. So first we will boil these liquids, or rather we heat these liquids up to the temperature of 56 degrees. Then what we can expect, the majority of the vapors that are coming through this would be of acetone only, and then we condense it. After most of the vapors get condensed, then again I'll start heating till it reaches 65 degrees. Now this time when the heating is been done, most of that will come out as methyl alcohol. So we will remove this out. This time when we collect, that sample will have major amount of methyl alcohol. Okay. So that's how we can separate out the two important liquids or two desired liquids using fractionating columns. In industry, honestly, when it comes to crude oil, right, we will have lot of outlets like this, right? Like this. In fact, the distillation columns are so big, they are up to the height of 30-40 meters also. So the crude oil keeps continuously boiling here, got it? And there will be trays like this. These are called trays. Okay. So the vapors will start moving through the trays like this. So as they start moving here, we will have condensers on the walls. So the liquid start condensing. At different temperatures, you will see at some point here we might get petrol, got it? Then maybe we can get diesel, we will get naphtha, got it? Then we might get Vaseline, got it? We might get wax and much heavy fatty acids here, like this. What does this tell us? That petrol would have least amount of boiling point as compared to diesel, then naphtha, Vaseline, wax, and rest of the fatty acids like this. Okay, so this is how the fractional distillation is done. Okay, mostly BPCL, HPCL, that is what their work is. Right, coming to the next part, which is vacuum distillation. All right, when do you see something called vacuum distillation or distillation under reduced pressure? Okay, now this is an important principle. The best example I can take is glycol. Okay, glycol or glycerol. Glycerine, you know that, right? Glycerol, which we call it as glycerine. See, the boiling point of glycerine is around 290 degrees centigrade. Okay, glycerine boils at a very high temperature. Alright, but the problem is, if you take glycerol and heat it up to 290 degrees, glycerol structure is like this: CH2OH, CHOH, and CH2OH. This is glycerol. Now, if you keep on heating for such long time, no, I mean to this high temperature, it will get completely dehydrated and you'll get alkene. So you're not getting the product which you want. You'll get something like this. Got it? But this is not the product you want. Got it? So which means I should not be taking this liquid to this high temperature. So what can I do? I just told you the definition of boiling point. Let me remind you once again. Boiling point of any liquid is the temperature at which the vapor pressure of the liquid will be equal to external pressure. Correct? Now, if the external pressure is minimum, if that is so less, if the external pressure is very less, then can you see the vapor pressure of the liquid will also be less here, or rather it would be easily met at a lower temperature. Everybody understood that? Alright. So the idea here is to reduce the pressure so that even at a lower temperature, right, the entire glycerol will get vaporized. Okay. Now see this, what we are doing, same flask, everything is same, got it, except where we are condensing, right, this entire state, see everywhere it is packed, everywhere it is closed. So whatever the pressure which you are doing, you are extracting every gas possible and keeping it as vacuum. So which means the pressure here through the entire columns is maintained at a very low pressure. Okay, somewhere around 12, we maintain 12 to 14 mm of Hg, which is very less. When you maintain at such low pressure, the vapor pressure will be very less now. So which means it can easily reach to this external pressure of 12 to 14 mm at very low temperature. So glycerol now can be easily boiled at around 180 degrees. See, from 290 degrees, I am bringing almost up to 180 degrees. So it becomes very easy for us to condense now. Okay, and the identity or the molecule identity will be retained. Got it? So the entire same glycerine will be, distilled here. I hope you understood the principle behind it, everyone. Okay. Acha, where do you use vacuum distillation? When the boiling point of the liquids is so high that if you bring it to that level, the molecular identity will be lost. So in those cases, we will use vacuum distillation. Now what we are doing in steam distillation? Now here the principle behind the steam distillation is to make sure water helps in vaporization. So the water comes as a steam and that will help the vapors to come out. Now what would happen? I'll tell you one example here. Suppose if you take aniline, okay, NH2, okay, or maybe aniline compound with two methyl groups here like this. Got it? This, if at all you see this compound, this already has a high boiling point. Second thing, it is immiscible in water. It is not going to get dissolved in water that easily. Got it? So if at all I have to separate this out, got it, with these impurities, right, what I can do? First I will add it to water, although it is less miscible or rather less dissolved here. I will pass through the steam here. So imagine this is a steam generator. So here I am heating the water so that it can have steam form. So steam is going into that, got it? And as steam enters into this impure organic substance, The steam will help this to get boiled at a high temperature, got it? And along with the steam, these vapors are also coming out. So along with some water vapor, this is also coming out. The principle behind steam distillation is that this molecule should be miscible with the water or miscible with the steam in its vapor state, not in liquid state but in vapor state. In vapor state it will be nicely mixed, I would say both of them should mix together and try to come at a lower boiling point. Got it? So principally, if at all I show you, okay, I've added it here, 1 minute. Yeah, check this. Principally, if at all I show you, organic liquid and water both will boil and both will come out as vapors. The vapor pressure of that liquid, which I call it as P1, and vapor pressure of water P2, both should, if they become equal to atmospheric pressure, then the entire solution will boil and those vapors will come out. Got it? So instead of directly heating and trying to reach to the boiling point, what we are doing, we are adding steam and increasing the vapor pressure. Got it? See, it is slight different than what we have done earlier. Here we have decreased the external pressure, and in here what we are doing, we are trying to increase the internal pressure so that it can reach to the external atmospheric pressure. I guess you understood what is the importance of steam distillation. Once that is done, the steam that comes through that condenser, we will take that hot liquid mixture and pass it through the condenser. Here you can see we are passing that through the condenser here. So condenser will condense it. Now after the condensation, because we know that both of them are immiscible, you know, water and this the organic substance is immiscible, they will come out as two different layers. One will be an organic layer, one will be a water layer. So it is very easy to separate them out because their densities are different. You will just pour through a filter paper and water can be separated out. The best examples that are normally used are this orthonitrophenol and p-nitrophenol. Got it? If you have a mixture of these two to be separated out, this is relatively more miscible in water. Orthonitrophenol is less miscible in water. So what we'll do, we pass this mixture through the through steam. So orthonitrophenol vapors along with steam can be condensed, okay, can be condensed through this, and finally when you have this distillation, when you cool it out and get the distillate, it will have, you can see this will be less, as I said, this orthonitrophenol will be less miscible, so it will come out as an organic layer and water will be left over. So this is about steam distillation. Okay. I guess all of you understood that, everyone, right? Coming to the next type of extraction, which is differential extraction. A differential extraction is pretty much simple here. I'll explain it here only. Check out. What we take here, first, sorry, it is on the basis of solubility. Okay. So we will check out which of them is more soluble or less soluble. Suppose if you have an organic layer, got it, organic substance, which also has some salt form. Imagine we have some salt form also. Most of the time it is like this, amines, R3N plus X minus. These are ammonium salts. Okay. When you have ammonium salts, the ammonia part is immiscible in water. That is, this is a combination of this beta, R3N plus X minus. Okay, this is R3, 1 minute, right, have to write it again. This is R4N plus and X minus. Okay. Now when you pass it through water, this will come out as R4, R4N plus, okay, plus HX plus OH minus. Okay. Now this OH minus might treat with this R4N plus and OH minus, and we might even see this as coming as R3 plus ROH plus HX. Now out of these, if you see this ROH and HX which I have written, these are water soluble and R3N is water insoluble. I hope you understood what I am trying to do. So when you have something like this ammonium salts, got it? They're already in a salt form but that has a lot of organic compound in it, like all ammonium, large alkyl ammonium salts. If I take that and add it to water, imagine I've added that to water. Slowly and steadily, what would happen? All of this water soluble, they will get into the aqueous part, and the leftover organic solvent, which is leftover organic compound which will be present, will be this. Got it? So we just have to leave it for over a time, so that both these layers get completely separated. Now once you get separated, slowly open this and remove carefully the entire water part which is present in it. Got it? So this part, organic part, which is like alcohol, this is an organic part which is soluble in aqueous layer, and this organic part which is soluble in organic layer. Got it? So that will left over in organic layer and this will get dissolved in aqueous layer. Both can be separated out. Is this case clear, everyone? This is called differential extraction. Okay. I'll show you one example. See here. For example, if you have benzoic acid, NaCl and water, all these are combined with each other as a mixture. I added it to benzene. Okay, so this solution I've added it to benzene. Then slowly and steadily, all the benzoic acid will enter into benzene layer. NaCl, water, they all will form a separate layer and becomes an aqueous layer. So this is an organic layer and this is an aqueous layer. Right? Like I said, it depends upon differences in the affinity of the compounds. We will have two phases, stationary phase or mobile phase. Stationary phase is always a liquid or a solid, while mobile phase will always be either a liquid or a gas. Okay. Now when it comes to the chromatography, that can be divided into two categories. One is adsorption chromatography, the other one is partition chromatography. In adsorption chromatography, the stationary phase is solid and the mobile phase is liquid or a gas, while in partition chromatography, the stationary phase is always liquid, mobile phase could be both liquid or gas, anything that could be. This is a major difference you need to understand. Gas chromatography has many sections. One of them is adsorption chromatography has many sections. One of them is gas solid chromatography, liquid solid chromatography. Within this also we can have liquid column chromatography and thin layer chromatography. Okay. For our syllabus, we just need an introduction of these two. That's all. What is liquid column chromatography and thin layer chromatography. Partition chromatography we will hardly see for our purposes, at least not in our syllabus. So for us, it is always about adsorption chromatography. Okay. But you got to know the differences, that every chromatography is categorized into these two forms, adsorption chromatography and partition chromatography. Got it. Now all the column chromatography, which is liquid column chromatography, is also known as column chromatography. So that column chromatography is what we will learn right now. So let me show you in column chromatography what exactly is happening in the pictorial way. I'll show you. Okay, check it out. So what we take first, in column chromatography, within this column, if you observe, there is a bed of adsorbent. Okay, adsorbent will be present here. This adsorbent usually will be a silica gel or an aluminium gel. Okay. So this adsorbent then it would have whatever the separated mixture which you want to do. For example, from here on top of the column, we will add that mixture. Let's say at time t equal to 0, I've added this mixture to the column. Out of this, few, let's say all the mixture compounds have A, B, C. This mixture has 3 compounds A, B, C. Out of these, some would be moving into the solution, okay, and the one which are moving, right, those are called the mobile phase solvents or mobile phase compounds, because throughout this solution we may have this entire thing is an, let's say, aqueous solution which has this adsorbent where we are using silica gel. Then we will have some sand above and below here just to make sure, you know, there is no silica gel leakages there. Got it? Later. Right. So later. Now as you add the mixture here, so it passes through it. Some of this mixture of compounds A, B, C, it might get stuck in here. Correct? Then we say it has more affinity with the stationary phase. Are you getting this, what I'm saying? Right? Same way, between this A, B, C, one might get completely moving through this entire column and comes down and settle here, which means that would be more affinity, that has more affinity with the mobile phase. I hope you understood that. Now this movement of this effluent phase, movement of this mixture through this mobile phase is what we call it as eluent. Okay, eluent means it is a slow movement of the mixture through the solvent. Got it? And this process is also known as elution. Okay, and that mixture or the compound which is passing through that mobile phase is called eluent. I guess you understood that point. Yeah. See what is happening over the time now. Here as you added the mixture, right, there would be some part which will be passing through that. C, A, B and C. Out of this, A got separated here only. A is not moving. Then B and C started moving here. Got it? And after some more time, B got separated and C is still moving. Got it? And C starts moving over the time, right? More time here, and finally the C will come down into the solvent. Is this clear, everyone? Okay. So first what got separated? C got separated. So if at all I ask you, out of A, B, C, which has more elution, what do you say? You will say C has more elution because it is showing more motion in the mobile phase. Are you getting that? A has more affinity with the stationary phase, so that's why it is not coming out fast. It is showing more affinity with the stationary phase. The stationary phase is made up of silica gel or anything that you can add which will absorb one of the solvents. So C is the one which we will separate out first. Then if you keep it for longer time, slowly B will come out of that and drip it, and that's how we can separate out B also. And if you keep it for even more longer time, A can be separated out as well, or you can simply remove it out and remove the adsorbent. Finally what you will have is only A. This is the column chromatography. So in column chromatography, we will always check out for basic principle is simple. You check out for elution. The one which has more elution will come out fast. The one which has less elution, that is the slow movement, will remain there in the stationary phase. So if given more amount of time, you remove this C, then you start seeing that B can be adsorbed. Now your question is right only when there is no color found, right? Column chromatography is mostly seen whenever there is a color difference. Got it? ABC must have a color difference. Next comes thin layer chromatography. Got it? Now in thin layer chromatography, what we will do, first we will take a glass. Mostly you will do this in engineering labs. Once you go to the engineering college, there most of you will do it. See, we take a glass tube here, got it? Sorry, a glass sheet here, and we paste everything with silica gel. Imagine all of that has been pasted with silica gel, and I keep it for drying, just to make sure it gets stuck to the glass strongly. First, we will make this to get dry. The thickness which I maintain usually would be 0.2 mm. Okay, so this would have a layer of silica gel, and that would be of a thickness 0.2 mm. Right, now it is dried, and then what we will do, the solution of the mixture here, correct? So we will take that mixture as a sample, and we place that sample somewhere here. Okay, that sample which we will take. Now that sample preferably must have high viscosity, or it should be a solid, so that it does not drop down that easily, and it should stuck to this stationary phase. So now this silica gel is the stationary phase, and we took that sample of mixture. This is the mixture which we need to separate. Got it? And we place it on that. Okay, this is called the sample spot, which has A and B. Imagine like this. Got it? And then what we will take this TLC plate, which is thin layer chromatography plate, and place it in the solvent. Got it? So we will take any of the solvent, maybe alcohol or water or any of that solvent, and we place it in this solvent. Got it? After placing in the solvent, one thing we have to take care of is that this dot should be above the solvent. It should not be touching the solvent, or else it will get dissolved in the solvent directly. Okay, and the minimum difference between the solvent and that should be maintained up to 2 centimeters. Anything more than 2 is fine, but minimum we should have 2 centimeters difference while you are putting it down. Okay. Now what would happen? The minute you touch this to solvent, the solvent will start moving rapidly in this stationary phase. Got it? So solvent has very high effluency. I hope you understood what I am saying. So solvent has the highest rate to travel, and it will start moving towards upwards. Got it? When it is moving upwards, as the solvent start moving upwards, this spot will come in contact with the solvent, and in that solvent phase, out of A and B, one of them will also start moving along with the solvent. Like you can see that on this plate, TLC plate, everything is moving. The solvent has almost come to this part. Okay, imagine like you take a biscuit. Biscuit is like a thin layer chromatography. Okay, Parle-G biscuit. You put it in water. Got it? That suppose that put it in glass of milk, which has very dilute milk. Let's say put it in water. You put it in that milk. Within no time, you will see water level will start rising, or rather water will start getting absorbed into that biscuit. So would I say the organic part of the milk or the water which has more effluency? Okay, eluency. The eluency would be more for water, na? It would be moving much faster rate. So I would say that water is the solvent. Got it? And there might be something on the biscuit. If you know, these are the small kid experiments which we do. If there is any color spot present on gems, or if you can take skitters, and those if you put it in water, slowly that color will start spreading out, diffusing out in the solution. The same thing will happen with this dot also. So in this dot, one of the component between A and B will move faster. So in this case, you can see which is moving faster. Component A is moving. Okay, so either component A or component B, one of them will move faster. Okay, and imagine from its origin place, or the original spot from where it is. If component as A has reached to some y dash mm and component B has moved to y mm and solvent has moved up to x mm. Got it? So using this you can easily see that A and B got separated out first of all. Okay, we can see that spot A and B are visible enough because first understand this, these are only possible with colored samples. We need to have this A and B to be colored samples and we can identify those spots getting completely separated. Okay. Acha, sometimes if the color is not found, just put it on the ultraviolet, put it in under the ultraviolet scanner, we will be able to see the colors. Okay, especially in the lab, the thin layer chromatography, there is an instrument, TLC instrument. In that we will have two zones, visible zone as well as ultraviolet zone. When nothing is seen in visible zone, we'll switch on the ultraviolet light and we'll see in that zone whether it got separated or not. So once you get separated out, then we will measure this distance. This has some significance, while calculating which has how much speed, because later on this information becomes useful in chromatography, but not for us. Our idea is only to separate both of them. Got it? So this is called a developed chromatograph. Okay. And from here we can define something called retention factor RF, and that retention factor is the distance traveled by compound from original spot or origin, that divided by distance traveled by solvent. So for example, if I have to find out retention factor of A, what would that be? For A it is this y dash, by x. Similarly, retention factor of B, what would that be? It would be y by x, right? And you see, retention factor will always be less than 1 because our entire idea is the solvent should move faster, correct? So retention factor will always be less than 1. This was asked in mains exam once, last year. What happens, which of the following is the correct statement, right? So he has given retention factor of the solvent A, retention factor of solvent solute or the compound A, compound B, like that. Okay, so now you should be able to identify this. So this is thin layer chromatography, right? So that depends upon what type of a solvent you are taking, beta. If it is silica gel, this will absorb faster. Suppose if it is any non-polar, like if this is some camphor, okay, suppose if I pasted the entire camphor on top, then if I take solvent as water, that will never rise. Water will repel camphor, got it? But if it is benzoic acid or toluene, the toluene will instantly rise faster into the camphor, got it? So depending upon what is the need, what separation you want to do, accordingly you will take the solvent, right? So I have put all the details in here, all the theory part I have written it here, so you don't have to write anything, just make sure go through each and every point here. Okay, while separating amino acids, okay, amino acids are nothing but proteins, got it? Especially if you want to see how two proteins are behaving, got it, which are of a similar molar mass or they have similarities and you want to separate them out, then we use thin layer chromatography, got it? And to show that amino acids look little bit colored, we can use ninhydrin. Ninhydrin is this compound. So this was asked as an objective question, like which will help to distinguish. Yeah, this is ninhydrin. Ninhydrin is a compound, got it? It is an keto compound. So this would help to give color on amino acids. Paper chromatography is used when you have liquid partition chromatography. Okay. Now here what we do, we will take that chromatographic paper, okay, what we call it as the Wattmann's filter paper, right? In this, what happens, water is already trapped in the molecular level, which means that paper already has a moisture inside, and that will act like a stationary phase because it is not moving. Okay, since water is not moving there, now water will act like this stationary phase because that got stuck in all the molecular levels of that filter paper. Okay. Now, as we have, suppose on this paper we already have some water present in it, got it? And now the same thing we'll do, just like a TLC what we have done here, also we'll do the same thing. We'll put the spot here, got it, and let it pass through the solvent, got it. Then this will get separated out, right? The one which has more affinity with the water, that will start moving. So it is based on the fact that different compounds of the mixture undergo partitioning between water and an organic solvent to differentiate that extent. So if this solvent which you are taking is organic, this dot which has more organic will have affinity with the solvents, and the one which has more affinity with the water, that will stay back. So now suppose in this, if you have, okay, let me write it as a diagram here. Between spot A and spot B, let's say spot B is here, spot A has moved to this far. Okay, obviously solvent will move faster, got it? So this is about solvent, and I have taken organic solvent. Now tell me, between A and B, which is more organic or which is more water soluble? Any of them, tell me. Which has more affinity with the organic solvent, which has more affinity with the water?
A has more affinity.
A has affinity with the solvent, correct, and B has affinity with the water. The compound A which is present, right? This compound A has more affinity with the mobile phase. Solvent is a mobile phase here, na beta, and silica gel is a stationary phase, correct? So the RF value tells us which is more in the mobile phase, which is more in the stationary phase. Are you getting it? That should help you. Suppose if you have a drug that is a targeted drug, okay, this will help you better. Listen, a targeted drug, a tumor which is present somewhere in the body, in intestines maybe, got it? You are fusing a drug, got it? Now first thing you will calculate in that drug is that the drug will have some salt also, it will have some organic compound, it will have some maybe some bacteria also, okay, right? So that drug which you have passed, it will pass through the blood, okay, through the blood, through plasma, it is trying to reach to the target place where the tumor is. While it is reaching exactly near the tumor, you have to, now the drug has to decide which will have more amount of RF value, because most of the tumor that is developed is mostly that is because of some organic compound, got it? So now the one which has more RF, correct, so that would have more reach into the tumor, got it? So initially while you are making the lab testing, you will find out of these two drugs which will move faster, okay, how much movement it will show into the tumor. Once this bacteria will enter into the tumor, it will start killing out whatever the growing cells which are happening, so it will completely stop that, got it? So that is where the chromatography helps immensely to understand which of the organic compound will move faster in that particular type of solvent. Now let us understand, okay, at least we'll do two estimation methods today, yeah, rest of the estimation methods and qualitative analysis we'll do tomorrow, okay? So simple ones we'll do right now, the difficult ones or we'll do it in a fresh mind in the morning tomorrow, okay? So these are very simple ones, simple combustion reaction actually, so that's why I'm taking out right now. Check out. This is called Liebig's method, and Liebig's method is nothing but estimation of carbon and hydrogen, okay? So earlier whatever we have studied, that is a purification part. Now we are trying to find out the estimation of every element in the organic compound. So how does it run? It runs on the principle that if we know the known organic compound and we burn it with oxygen in the presence of dry Cu2O, correct? Then we might get some gases. Based on that, we will be estimating how much amount of carbon and hydrogen is present. Just let me write the combustion reaction, that should help. We know that CxHy plus 2x plus y by 2 of CuO, right? On reacting, it might give us x moles of CO2, right, plus y by 2 moles of H2O. Sorry, this is O2, no? Right, y by 2 moles of this, got it? And suppose, because I am taking it CuO initially, right, so I am taking it as CuO, how much amount of copper will get reduced? We will have 2x plus y by 2 moles of copper will get reduced. This is what is expected to happen in Liebig's method. So rather than simply directly combining with oxygen, I am using CuO. The purpose why we are using that CuO, let me show you. Got it? Here we are using oxygen anyway. See, we are using excess of oxygen, but in the presence of CuO, we will see that copper will get reduced into copper form. Copper oxide will reduce into this copper form. Okay. So the point is, any form of carbon which is present here with whatever oxidation state it has, all of that will convert into carbon dioxide. That is what we wanted to show. Okay. Now, see that we will have carbon dioxide and H2O that has been produced, and that is been, whatever that has been produced will be absorbed into anhydrous magnesium perchlorate or CaCl2. Those are dehydrating agents. Okay. Now the increased mass in that is what we will calculate. I'll show you how it is happening through this experiment. Check out carefully. So what we are doing, we are adding some dry oxygen, okay, and here we have organic compound, right, and this is the hot furnace. This red color is a hot furnace, with cupric oxide in it. So this entire organic compound in dry oxygen, they all are heated up and they are passing through this hot furnace with CO. So most of it get reacted, most of the carbon will form into carbon dioxide, hydrogen will form into water, and here we are letting all those gases to come out of it. So what are the gases we can expect to come out of this? We can have carbon dioxide, H2O, as well as O2. These three will come out of this, and we will let it pass through, mixture here which is of anhydrous calcium chloride, or we can use this as magnesium perchlorate. Both of them are good dehydrating agents. Got it? So I can use anhydrous calcium chloride or magnesium perchlorate. So what they will do, they will absorb all the water into it, and here the gases will come out again, and these gases would be mixture of carbon dioxide and oxygen, and we will let that gases pass through this U-shaped column. Now here we are using soda lime, okay, either soda lime or NaOH. Got it? Sorry, soda lime or KOH. Soda lime itself is NaOH, right? This one. So you can take either KOH or NaOH, any of that, because both of them will react with carbon dioxide, and then there would be leftover gas which will come out, that is a dry O2 gas which will come out of it. Got it? So this is exactly what is happening throughout the experiment. Now, initially we will measure how much amount of anhydrous calcium chloride you had. Then after the experiment again we'll measure this, because this would be connected to a weighing machine. Okay. So when we will measure how much is the new weight now. So we will find out the increased weight here. So we'll try to find out what is the increased weight. Same is the case here also. We'll try to find out what is the increased weight in this case. Suppose if m is the mass of the organic compound and m1 is the mass of water and m2 is the mass of carbon dioxide that got adsorbed, then can I say that, okay, if you have hydrogen, the amount of hydrogen, number of moles of hydrogen, if you need to check out, correct? So that would be, right, m1 mass, you can check it out how much moles of hydrogen that is formed here. So hydrogen would be whatever, this is an m1 mass, right? So which is the mass of water, that m1 mass divided by 18 will give us the number of moles of water, and that multiplied by 2 will give us the amount of hydrogen, because every water will have 2 hydrogen molecules. So this is the amount of hydrogen present in that organic compound, correct? So if I convert this into percentage, so percentage hydrogen present in that organic compound will be 2 into m1 by 18, right? This is the mass, divided by capital M, which is the mass of the organic compound, multiplied by 100. So this is the percentage mass of hydrogen present in organic compound. Everybody understands that, right? Same way, if I can calculate the percentage carbon, so percentage carbon would be equal to 12 times of M2 divided by 44 into M into 100. If anybody who hasn't understand that, please do ask right now. This is how we calculate the percentage of carbon and hydrogen. See here, water got adsorbed, right? Which means mass has been increased. Original mass, suppose if original was m naught, now the mass is m naught dash. So the difference here, right? So the difference of this is what we are writing it as m1, and the difference here we are writing it as m2. I hope that point is clear. That m1 and m2 is the mass of water and mass of carbon dioxide which has been deposited in this. Where did that come from? That came from organic compound only. So what we are doing here, so in that organic compound, what we will do, we will try to find out how much amount of hydrogen it has. We know that m1 is the mass of water which you have, correct? So those who are confused here, m1 is the mass of H2O that has been formed. So mass divided by molar mass, what do I get? Number of moles. Okay, I'll get number of moles, right? And you know that one water molecule will have how many moles of hydrogen? We have 2 moles of hydrogen. 2 into number of moles of hydrogen, correct? You have done POAC, no? Principle of atom conservation. So I am doing the same thing.
Yes, sir.
So 1 mole of water, I am writing it as 2 moles of hydrogen atom. What is the molar mass of hydrogen atom? 1, no? So 2 into 1. So what will be the weight of hydrogen now? 2 times of m1 divided by 18. So this is the mass of hydrogen atom, and that is the mass present in the organic compound. So if I want percentage amount of hydrogen atom, this mass divided by mass of that organic compound into 100, that will give percentage hydrogen. I hope that is clear, right? Now same thing I am doing it for carbon also. So every carbon dioxide, number of moles of carbon dioxide will be same as number of moles of carbon, POAC again, correct? So how many moles of carbon dioxide are formed? M2 by 44. M2 is the mass, 44 is the molar mass. The ratio is moles. Number of moles multiplied by atomic mass of carbon will give the mass of carbon. Mass of carbon divided by mass of organic compound into 100, percentage carbon will come. Is that clear, everyone? Right? So that information would be asked, so you should be able to calculate that. This is called Liebig's method of calculating carbon and hydrogen. Suppose if there was, can you mute that? Yeah. Suppose if there was nitrogen also present in it, correct? If there was some nitrogen present in it, correct? That would also come into this, no? Right? That is the reason why we are using copper oxide, because if there is any nitrogen which is converting into nitrogen dioxide or nitrogen oxide, okay, nitrous oxide, correct, N2O4, any of this formation, nitrogen if it is doing, in the presence of CuO, it will get oxidized only to N2 and copper will get reduced, okay, not this one, sorry, got it. So all of this nitrogen will get, you know, oxidized or reduced only to get N2 gas in the presence of CO. That is why we are using CO rather than directly making a combustion. Are you getting it? So if there was any nitrogen also present in it, what will it do, beta? That will also come out as nitrogen gas outside. Outside also you will have, along with oxygen, you will have nitrogen, because nitrogen don't get absorbed in this or this. So this percentage mass, correct, with does not mean that sum of these two will be equal to mass of the organic compound. Is this clear, beta? Next, estimation of nitrogen. If you want to calculate nitrogen, there are two methods. Today we will just discuss Dumas method, easier ones. Got it? So Dumas method, same thing we are doing here again, because this time I have to calculate nitrogen. No? So what I will do from here, so first I will take this organic compound here with copper oxide and heat in the furnace, this plus organic compound. Obviously, if I am trying to find out nitrogen, I always expect this organic compound to have nitrogen in it. And this is a hot furnace in which we are adding this, and I will keep a copper gauge, got it? I'll keep a copper gauge here, right? In case any other oxides which are coming, nitrogen oxides which are coming, they will immediately react with the copper mesh and convert into N2 gas, okay? So that eventually whatever that is coming through this should only be N2 gas. I hope all of you understood so far, yeah? So now what we are doing, we are adding initially some excess amount of carbon dioxide, little bit of carbon dioxide initially, okay, right, just to maintain an inert atmosphere, because carbon dioxide is not going to make any reaction here, understood? So we'll just add some carbon dioxide to that, just to keep that entire hot furnace inert. Then adding this, after the reaction is done, imagine some amount of nitrogen gas started coming out of it. So let's say this is nitrogen gas. In case if there are any, you know, side gases like N2O or NO or NO2, like I said, all of this, when you react with copper or copper gauge, they will convert into N2, got it? So copper will get oxidized, this nitrogen will get reduced, okay, and that will get to the formation of N2. And whatever the nitrogen that has formed here, this would only have N2 content more, and this would be very, very less now, only in traces maybe. N2O, NO and N2 gases will be in traces now. So this N2 we have, carbon dioxide we have, water we have. These are the gases which will come out of the mesh. Let that pass through, you know, a liquid column which is mainly of aqueous solution, KOH aqueous solution. Okay. So if it is KOH aqueous solution, carbon dioxide will get completely absorbed in it, because KOH immediately reacts with carbon dioxide, right, to form K2CO3. So all the carbon dioxide will get absorbed here. and water will anyway be present, water will anyway stay back here, only nitrogen gas will bubble out. So here whatever the gas that is coming will be of N2 gas bubbling out. But water will also have some vapor pressure, no? So if you calculate the pressure here, pressure of gases, so usually we measure the pressure. So when you measure the pressure here, it would be pressure of N2 plus pressure of water also. Okay, some amount of water also present in it. What do you mean by pressure of water? That is nothing but aqueous tension, no? So at a particular temperature, we will define it as an aqueous tension. So the collected gas will be, a sum of partial pressure of nitrogen and aqueous tension. So this is this entire tube which is collecting nitrogen through it, that is called nitrometer, correct? So even if you have any sulfur present in this, that will also come as sulfur dioxide, and sulfur dioxide will also get dissolved in it to form K2SO4, got it, or K2SO3. So therefore even sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, everything will get adsorbed here itself. So hardly anything would be present there. I hope that is clear. Now how do we do the calculation? Now let me write this here. Let us assume the mass of organic compound as some m grams, okay, and volume of N2 gas that was collected, let us call it as V1 ml, and the temperature at which we are doing this collection of gas, temperature, let us have this as T degree centigrade. This will be in kelvins. This temperature, if you write it in kelvins, that will be 273 plus whatever the information you will get in degree centigrade. And atmospheric pressure, let that be P mm of Hg. Copper gauge will not reduce sulfur dioxide, okay? It will come out of that and it will get adsorbed in K2SO4, KOH here. Next, atmospheric pressure, let us keep it as P mm of Hg, and aqueous tension of water, aqueous tension of H2O at this particular temperature, let me call it as F mm of Hg, F mm of Hg. So what will be the actual pressure exerted now? Actual pressure exerted by N2 gas. You see that reading. So the pressure which we were found minus the aqueous tension. So this is the pressure which we have read. This is the pressure which we have read. That subtract by aqueous tension, that should be the actual pressure given by nitrogen, okay? Or this is what we call it as dry gas pressure. You may have recently learned in gaseous state what is dry gas pressure.
Yes.
Correct. So from there, now I know volume of N2 at STP. See, I can directly do the calculation also, but usually the standardization is always done with respect to STP, okay, just to make sure we'll get more accurate value. So volume of N2 at STP, if at all we say it is, V volume, V ml taken, correct? Then I can say that P1 V1 by T1 should be equal to P2 V2 by T2. So volume at STP will have 760 mm of Hg plus V, if at all I take it as a volume, by temperature is 0 degree centigrade, so 273 kelvins. That must be equal to pressure, which is P minus F multiplied by V1, which is the volume of N2 collected, divided by 273 plus T, which is in degree centigrade. So from here we will calculate the volume. So the volume will be P minus F into V1 into 273 divided by 760 into 273 plus T. So we got this as the volume. Okay. So based on this volume, I can calculate number of moles of N2, which will be equal to volume in ml divided by 22400. You know that why I have written that 22400. Once you get the number of moles, you know what is the weight or mass of nitrogen present in the organic compound. That would be N into 28, correct? N2 gas, sorry, weight and this of N2 gas, mass of N2 gas is N into 28, correct? And from there I can calculate what is the percentage amount of N present in organic compound. So that would be 28 times of N, right? And what was the value of N here? We saw that as V by 22400. So 28 into V by 22400 into M into 100. Usually the formula, Dumas formula, is directly given this way. So I hope now you know what has been derived through. Okay. So 28 into V divided by 400 into M into 100 here. So that would be amount of nitrogen. Let me repeat that. For C, there was no purpose of taking STP honestly. We know the volume already. We know this pressure. We know what temperature you are operating. Directly we can calculate number of moles here, right? And check out how much amount of percentage present in oxygen. For simple calculation purpose, you can do that. Why we are standardizing that with STP is just to ensure that the volume which you have calculated, you know, whatever that volume which you have calculated is more accurate. Because if this was calculated at this temperature and if you standardize that with respect to STP, that will give a more accurate value. That's the only reason. Otherwise, there is, even if this information is given, it is sufficient enough. All you need to know is pressure, volume and temperature, right? So number of moles will be PV by nRT. So I can use that and do it. Okay. So just to close that, let us end that with a question now. Check out. An experiment for an estimation of N2 by Dumas method, 0.188 grams of organic compound was present, which is giving 31.7 ml of H2. So volume is given. Volume is given for N2 gas as 31.7 ml. Temperature is given 14 degrees centigrade. Pressure which was collected is given as 758 mm. This is the pressure which was read. Calculate the percentage nitrogen in the compound. Aqueous tension is given, right? So from that information I can calculate dry gas pressure. Dry gas pressure would be 758, which is the total pressure, minus aqueous tension. You will get this as 746 mm of Hg. Now what will be the volume at STP? See, without even calculating STP also, I'll show it. I can directly use it as number of moles is equal to PV by nRT, and I can do this, PV by RT, and I can get the value of N. Just to be more precise, we use STP condition. See here, if at all I use STP condition, first I'll calculate volume at STP, which will be 746, which is the pressure here. So I'm directly using this as a formula. You can see that this as a formula. Got it? That into V, that into volume, which is 31.7, multiplied by 273 divided by 760 multiplied by 273 plus 14, so which is 287. Correct. So from here you will get the volume at STP, and this volume on calculating, approximately this is coming as 29, around 29 ml. So we got the volume at STP, right? Once you get the volume at STP, all you need to do is calculate the percentage of nitrogen present in organic compound. That would be, now I am using this formula, which is 28 multiplied by 29 divided by 22400 into molar mass, mass of the organic compound, which is 0.188 into 100. That comes to be around 20%. I hope you guys understood Dumas method. Anybody has a problem, please do ask now.